Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Talk Conversation Series, a peer knowledge resource by the CXOs for the CXOs. Now to our host, Kanika Goswami.
Welcome to our podcast today on stage with enterprise thought leaders. Today we have as our guest Mr. Aniruddho Basu. He's the Executive Vice President of Emerging Business at Mavenir. Welcome to the show, Aniruddho. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Kanika. Pleasure to be here.
I feel the same way, Aniruddha. So he brings to his role over 25 years of experience in the ICT sector, working for a number of multinationals and Fortune 500 companies in roles that span, I think, the entire breadth and length of any enterprise role could be just sales, business development, strategy, commercial management, product management, portfolio management, operations, R&D. And when he's not doing all of this, Aniruddha has a deep interest in motorbikes and sports, and that is another very interesting aspect of it. Is that right?
Yes, thank you for those kind words. I don't know if I'm 1/10 as competent as my profile makes me out to be, but I'll try and give it a shot.
Well, I mean, it's really expansive. So even if you're not all there, it is still quite impressive, I must say. So a little bit about the company. Mavenir is focusing on the vision of a single software-based automated network that runs on any cloud. Their solutions include a wide range of networking technologies, 5G, mobile enterprise communications, and all the way to unified communications and collaboration platforms. They are the industry's only end-to-end software-driven network infrastructure company with a very clear vision statement of one network, any cloud, all software. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, great. So, should we start with the questions, Aniruddha, if you're ready?
Absolutely ready to go.
So, as organizations accelerate their digital transformation and are increasingly embracing the remote and hybrid work environment, what network challenges could they encounter when scaling their business operations?
That's a very interesting question and a very interesting dilemma that's faced by most enterprises and even consumers today in an increasingly mobile and hybrid workspace. The last 2 years of COVID have shown a dramatic change in the way traffic patterns are looking like across networks. There are more and more people that are working from homes, from remote locations. There is an increasing amount of focus from an enterprise standpoint to deliver goods and services remotely, whether it's e-education to healthcare services, to sometimes even as simple things as online shopping and e-commerce. Now, as consumers, as workers, and enterprises collectively look at staying connected to their places of work, to their service providers, to the portals or the engines from which they consume value and create, generate, and publish value, from a networking standpoint, I think there are probably three aspects that are paramount in their minds. One, of course, is consistent accessibility. So, which means increasingly more so in such a hybrid world, they want access to their networks, to their mobile networks, to allow them to stay mobile, to stay connected at all given points of time, 24/7, 365 days a year. So, accessibility is definitely one aspect. The second aspect, I would say, is potentially security. As we move outside of very tightly managed and constrained IT and connectivity environments in the enterprise and workplace, and you are essentially coming out of a more controlled environment, you're starting to use more and more of your own devices. How does the enterprise, how does that employer, how does that organization, and potentially even how does that consumer or worker guarantee the fact that they're operating in a safe and secured environment? In a world where there's increasing instances of cyber threats and cyber attacks and even personal attacks on IT security and connectivity. So second would be security. The third, I would say, and potentially not the final one, but definitely a consideration, is as we start to create and generate different kinds of applications and use cases, performance of that network is paramount. So we are no longer only texting, we are increasingly using more amounts of video, interactive tools. There are industries and manufacturing plants that are looking at remote activation and actuation and control of plant assets, with lab workers or potentially even manufacturing workers not being physically present on site. So the performance of the network is also critical, is also a very critical consideration as they go forward. So these three network challenges, accessibility, security, and performance, potentially are the cornerstones of any organization's digital transformation strategy. These are essentially the three things that are on the top of the agenda of any enterprise IT head or a CTIO or a CSO, and potentially nowadays even the CEO and CSO and the CFO as they consider their next steps into this digital journey. Was that helpful?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I have a little question there, but I'll ask you about it later. The next question we have lined up is, what are the effective ways for organizations to implement an open 5G cloud native network? And how does Mavenir's web scale platform help organizations with this?
Probably a bit of a leading question into the 5G piece, but I would maybe preface that by saying why 5G? And my reflection would be, so far in the last 3 to 4 decades, as we look back on the 2G era, the 3G era, and the 4G era, the role that mobile networks specifically have played has been in terms of being able to connect consumers to services that they need, for instance, through smartphones and app stores. Or, in fact, even earlier than that, it was primarily connecting consumers to each other. So whether it was voice or it's text messaging, and nowadays, let's say, social media and so on. The one big change from, let's say, that era into, let's say, as we get into the 2020s and beyond, is a shift in terms of, we are no longer looking at connecting consumers. We are actually looking at the next big phase of transformation, and that's in the enterprise and the industrial space. And more enterprise and industries are looking at ways of harnessing the power of data to optimize their operations, create more value, and become more flexible, agile, and cost effective in a very highly competitive world. As they do that, there are primarily two considerations that any enterprise slash on an industry would have. One is, how do we generate the right kind of data and in adequate volumes? And the second would be, how do we create insights and contextualize that data and make it meaningful to our daily operations? Now, in order to get data to move around, to generate data, to have data in transit, to be able to analyze data, you need connectivity. So I think one of the biggest considerations in terms of enabling the data engine for most organizations nowadays is the big conundrum or question around, what kind of network or connectivity platform should I have? And the big promise of 5G compared to the previous generations of technology has been, we are now moving into a G which is oriented more towards enterprise requirements, data-centric requirements, with very unique capabilities that didn't exist in the previous generations. Things like, ultra reliable low latency networks, 1/20th the latencies of commercial LTE networks, the possibility to handle 1,000-fold increase in the number of connected devices per megahertz of spectrum, the possibility of architecting a network platform that can be decomposed and put not just as appliances in switch rooms somewhere, but essentially running as network functions in an IT cloud or even a public cloud. So the effective ways for organizations to really look at their digital transformation needs would be to A, identify the fact that mobility and connectivity is essential to data centricity. B would be to realize the fact that what 2G to 4G did for the consumer-centric society of today and the whole mobile transformation of the world from an individual standpoint until 2020, that mechanism, that innovation engine needs to be brought into the organizations and into each enterprise to transform them now as let's say phase two of this big digital transformation activity. So the effective ways for them to look at would be to acknowledge that 5G is basically that kind of technology. It is as IT-fied as telecoms can get. It has adopted the best principles of open interfaces, microservices, containerization and virtualization. It has adopted some of the best of breed from the vertical integration and resilience of telecom building practices to the horizontal innovation, open APIs approach from the IT organizations and IT, let's say IT domain, and married that with the scaling impacts and effects that we have seen from web scale players and the power of cloud. So if we combine, resilience from telecoms with horizontal innovation and open interface from IT with the power of the cloud, these are essentially the three tenets of the new connectivity layer. And that kind of segues into what you already, kind of called out as our vision for the future, one network, any cloud, all software. So our web scale platform is essentially a foundation on top of which all of these three elements are seamlessly integrated. We are 3GPP certified and compliant, which means very vertically resilient and vertically integrated in terms of a telecom stack. But we are very software driven, which allows us to drive the power and pace of innovation that comes in from the IT world through principles like CI/CD and DevOps. And it marries that with the capabilities of a horizontal, flexible, and scalable cloud platform, which gives rise to a connectivity layer that's more suited for enterprises. I know that was a bit of a long answer, but hopefully that made sense as well.
Oh, yes, it does. And the longer the answer is, it gives me more points to ponder and, create more questions, which I'm keeping for the end because we need to finish what we've already discussed once. So the next question is, what types of advanced technologies are needed for enabling a seamless connection across enterprises, industries, and even service providers?
That's a good question. So I would say instead of advanced technologies, I would maybe focus on certain capabilities that the connectivity layer, for instance, should have. One of the capabilities should be that it needs to be scalable. That essentially means that so far what service providers have done has been the ability to scale connectivity and technologies for tens of millions of subscribers. So macrocellular networks have essentially scaled up. What we should now start to look at is how can we encapsulate and still retain those upward scaling benefits as we scale down complex connectivity technologies into an enterprise footprint. How is it possible to take a 10-year-old innovation cycle, which is typically the time it takes for 1G to be generated in telecoms, and fold that into a couple of servers or a cloud application somewhere and still deliver the same kind of performance and capabilities that regular macrocellular networks do? So from that perspective, some of the advanced technologies we should look at that allows us to do it are things coming in from the IT world, like containerization, virtualization, creating microservices, and so on. Couple that with, from a scaling standpoint, the other ability that networks should have is essentially the ability to allow for innovation over the top. So if you really think about why macrocellular networks and smartphones succeeded, wasn't just because of the connectivity layer. It was simply because we were able to abstract the complexity of the underlying 3G and 4G networks and essentially made it accessible to a developer who could be sitting in a garage someplace writing some lines of code, was able to launch an app in the App Store for 99 cents and immediately get 10 million subscribers on the first day of launch. That is what fundamentally transformed the consumer-centric society of ours. Now, what we should be looking at for the next generation of connectivity as we get into enterprise and industries is to enable an app store approach for enterprise and industry. And by that, I mean the accessibility of that underlying complex connectivity layer with 5G, with open interfaces towards the top that allows any developer, any enterprise, or any industry to create value and applications and use cases over the top. They should be transparent to the complexities underneath. And what allows them to do that is essentially a much more open and broader set of open APIs, a much more, let's say, open cloud native approach, an IT centric approach to building networks. The third, I would say, and that's absolutely essential, is as complexities increase, as we start to work with more and more complex technologies at a granular level, on the surface, it needs to be as simple as possible. And what I would then kind of put that analogous to is think about the whole connectivity layer as a physical body. No matter how many complex iterations the rest of the parts of the body does, the real intelligence lies in the brain. So I think the most amount of R&D dollars and development efforts that are going in currently are essentially in the management orchestration layer. So the heart and lungs, or if you even go more northbound, the brains of the network. We need to make, with advanced techniques such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, allow for the underlying network with still finite resources to be managed much more intelligently and autonomously than ever before. So yeah, I would say essentially these three.
Right. Our next question, Aniruddha, is something I was actually thinking about asking you after hearing your answer to my first question. It was about security. So, with cyber attacks on the rise, especially given the remote working dynamics that's happening right now, what is the best strategy for organizations to adopt so they may quickly deploy new features for better network security?
That's always, I mean, we'd run a bit of a survey of our enterprise clients and our service provider clients. And we'd come up with a very interesting word cloud. This is something we had done with Omdia about a year back. And the one big word that stands out in the word cloud, whether we talk 5G or private networks or next generation connectivity, is always security. And there is no easy answer. So I always kind of go back to saying that security is going to be about people, processes, and technology. It always starts with people first. So as we get into a more hyper-connected world, definitely with remote working and all of the challenges and constraints that a hybrid work environment brings, it is beholden on every individual, whether they consume services for their own self or they contribute towards an organization or they're part of a broader organization, to make themselves aware and familiar with the tools that they have at their disposal when it comes to IT security and network security. We are familiar with a lot of them. We get bombarded with reminders from our banks on phishing alerts and what have you. So I think the first onus, without laying everything at the doorstep of technology and organizational process, is an increased responsibility of the modern worker, the modern consumer, to be aware of their environments, the changing facets of technology, and how best to use the tools they have at their disposal. So I see an increasing amount of worker trainings that are already happening. I see most organizations investing much more in terms of online training, in terms of tools and methodologies to empower their workers to, make this transition much more smoother. The second part I would say is process. We can, and we sometimes tend to, as organizations, over-engineer processes. And if we wish to transform as an organization into the digital era, to really have onerous IT and security processes that pulls back the rapidity and and adaptability and really stifles the pace of change, is not the best idea. So I think the second part, next to, let's say, the individuals themselves, is organizations need to revisit their security practices and processes, make them as automated as possible. And this is kind of a little bit of a call out to the previous question that you'd asked, and I'd referred, if you remember, to advanced technology, things like AI and ML. So there's a lot of automation possible which will allow uh, a faster capture of anomalous behavior, identification of threats, and immediate remediation measures as well. Hopefully, that will simplify the process element in the organizations themselves, which then, of course, leads to all of this is fine, but what about technology? Now, technology is always in a state of flux. So if you think about how we protect things and how people try and break that protection, there is nothing on the planet that's 100% secure. And there'll always be backdoors. There's an increasing, let's say, threat surface that is increasing simply because the number of unmanaged devices in an enterprise environment will increase. There'll be people that are not following the right processes. All of these will lead to situations where there will be threats. But the good news is, given the rapid developments and advancements of technology, whether it's in terms of blockchain or it's in terms of embedded security principles like hardware trust anchors uh, for instance, from the 3GPP side of things, 5G having one of the best embedded security principles coming in from the cellular industry, those technology principles will always exist. And they will also adapt, evolve, and support, hopefully, the changing mores of people and processes in the organization as well.
So, as we'd earlier discussed, open standards could play a very pivotal role in maybe a dynamic kind of a speed for innovation or whatever. I mean, I don't know what you would like to call it, but what role do you really think that open standards will play if we are to look at better innovation in the networking space as such?
That's an excellent question. If you think back, maybe go back about 20 odd years, uh, you would probably, if you were to canvass the total number of well known telecom infrastructure players, you would come up with at least 15 to 20 names. The Motorola's of the world were standalone companies. There was Nortel, there was Siemens was on their own, Lucent was on its own. There were a number of large, well-established powerhouses. In about 20, 25 years, if you really think about it now, the well-known incumbent technology providers with generally a fair amount of scale and size are less than the fingers on your hand. It's essentially a couple of Nordic players and some Asian players. That has essentially meant that over this period of 2 decades, the total amount of R&D dollars invested as a percentage of the value created in the supplier industry has shrunk by potentially a factor of 3 or 4. That is not good news because it tends to lead to two things. One is, of course, less investment means eventually less innovation and less inventions and generally less evolution. The second is, as the number of players shrink from large numbers to a smaller oligopoly, there is a reluctance in the industry to innovate, and there's a proclivity to preserve the status quo. That fundamentally stifles change. Now, what Mavenir is happy to champion is exactly what you said. This whole, let's say, we would like to be the lighthouse or the flag bearer of open interfaces and open standards. Still based on standards bodies, things like 3GPP and NGMN, but definitely open interfaces and much more open standards. Simply because that allows for more companies which are banking on newer technologies that have been created or formed or that have been born in a much more cloud native, software first, cloud powered era in the last 10 to 15 years. That means these smaller companies, which may not have the deep pockets or the 100-year histories of some of the incumbents, are able to somehow suddenly find the playing field much more level. And that essentially means these kind of open standards will allow for more companies to come in. That means that in the technology infrastructure segment, instead of 4 or 5 players, there could be 20, 25 players, each of whom are rapidly innovating. And that creates pressure on the system on two fronts. One, it encourages the incumbents to also wake up and start to move, which is healthy for the entire group and the industry. And the second, by simple, sheer brute force of numbers and competence, uh, if you throw more intelligent and clever people and companies into the mix, the industry overall benefits. So I think open standards is not just a technology conundrum. Open standards is, I would say, the gatekeeper to, and if I may say so, the key to unlocking the potential that we have in the next generation of networks and the evolution of connectivity and telecoms.
That's good to know, Aniruddha. Is there any work that Mavenir is doing in this direction, using open standards for development and innovation, or getting new products out in the
absolutely. I
market?
think if you think back about 10, 15 years, one of the biggest changes that happened in the vertically integrated telecom stack was the realization that we could actually virtualize network functions and put them essentially on the same IT infrastructure that traditional enterprise IT infrastructure would have, along with their IT work processes and IT functions. And that was the whole big movement from a core network standpoint, starting with the voice core and IMS and voice over LTE to eventually the data core like the EPC and the 5G core, which effectively became, instead of appliances and big switch rooms, simple little software pieces, either as a virtualized network function or a container. So that was the first big step that telecoms took to adopting more open interfaces and more IT-like behavior. And that, as you can see, has really led to a proliferation and wider adoption of these kind of technologies in more enterprises and more service providers, and a much more rapid scaling of the capabilities of networks in the last 15 years. Now, the last bastion of proprietary standards is in an area that I would say potentially is 10 times as bigger as the core network side, and that's the access or the radio access side of things. And the industry so far has benefited from standards and homologation on, let's say, the spectrum asset side of things, which allowed for, roaming and device proliferation and a wider adoption of cellular technologies as a whole. But as part of the whole, let's say, reduction of the competitive space that I spoke of just briefly before, those 20 odd companies shrinking to 4 to 5, that has essentially meant the radio access layer has not been able to adopt the same kind of building practices, innovation, principles, and let's say reduction in cost per bit as has happened in the core network side. So radio and radio access still remains the last bastion of proprietary standards and interfaces. So Mavenir is the flag bearer, I would say, and the champion of ORAN or Open RAN, which essentially means that we are looking to cut, in layman's terms, the umbilical cord between the radio hardware that you mount on a tower to the actual intelligence that happens in the baseband. And that will allow for much more rapid innovation, capability, co-creation, and faster development and lowering of costs on the baseband side, which is going to be very, very powerfully software-driven and cloud-native, and it should get into the same containerization and virtualization principles as the core network. And at the same time, it decouples the hardware element and allows for more hardware players to come in who, based on these open standards, will be able to interface with any kind of baseband. And that allows, as you introduce more and more hardware suppliers into the mix, an obvious scaling capability. There'll obviously be more players that are able to address more frequency bands. And as volumes go up and the share of the pie or the total size of the pie also grows, that effectively means the hardware costs will also come down, which in a way is a very healthy cycle, which will drive faster adoption and broader adoption of cellular technologies in enterprise and industry. So yes, we believe in open standards. The last bastion of open standards and open interfaces needs to be the radio access layer. Mavenir is a strong proponent of Open RAN.
Oh, that's good to know. We can expect some more interesting conversations about that in our next probably meeting. And thank you so much for your time today, Aniruddha. It was really nice talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being with us. Please do follow us on social media for regular updates and new content.